When the Renters' Rights Act comes into force, all tenancies, assured tenancies, will have an implied term that a tenant can keep a pet. So, does this mean that all tenants will have the right to keep pets whenever they like? No, it's not a carte blanche. And in this video, I explain what this implied right actually means, the processes that tenants are going to have to follow, and when landlords can actually say no if a tenant asks to keep a pet. And stick around till the end, as I'm going to share my own experiences of allowing tenants to keep pets to help you reduce the risk of pet damage. And who am I? I'm Suzanne Smith, lawyer turned landlord, and I run the independent.com website and this YouTube channel to bring free, reliable guidance to everyone in the private rented sector. And you can sign up for my free weekly newsletter at theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. Right, let's get started by talking about why landlords don't like letting to tenants with pets. According to Zoopla, only 7% of rental homes are advertised as pets allowed. Yet, we're a nation of animal lovers. So, why don't landlords like letting to tenants who have pets? Well, it comes down to the fact that landlords are worried that dog and cats, in particular, less a problem for goldfish, will cause damage to the property by scratching, chewing, leaving hair everywhere. We used to have a yellow Labrador, and the hair was quite challenging to keep on top of. And the problem is that since the Tenant Fees Act came into effect, landlords haven't been able to take a bigger deposit for tenants with pets. And some charge an extra pet rent, but most landlords have just concluded it's better to avoid tenants with pets. They don't want the risk or the hassle. Yet, in a study of 2,000 landlords who actually allowed pets that was carried out by the University of Huddersfield in 2024, they concluded that pet damage was more of a perceived concern amongst landlords rather than first-hand accounts. In fact, in their study, 76% of landlords reported there had been no damage caused by pets in their rental properties. And that's my experience as well. I never used to be pet friendly, but my adult children, who are both renters at the moment, explained to me how important pets are to tenants. And they also pointed out that many tenants will get a pet anyway and just hide it. So it's better to accept it and be open about it, unless there's a good reason not to agree to a pet. But I'll come on to that a bit later. And speaking of later, enter the Renters' Rights Bill. When the Renters' Rights Act comes into force in late 2025, early 2026, and we don't yet know as I'm recording this towards the end of April, landlords are going to need good reasons to turn down a request from a tenant if they want to keep a pet, as they'll have the right to ask for a pet once they've moved in. And it doesn't technically apply to people who are looking to let, so applicants, only those who are already tenants. Although, of course, an applicant could just say they don't have a pet, get somebody to look after it for a few weeks, and then ask once they've moved in. So let's move into the process that's outlined in the Renters' Rights Bill that tenants will need to follow to the letter. So the implied right for tenants to keep a pet is not absolute, and tenants do need to follow a procedure before the landlord needs to make a decision. And this is the process that the tenant will need to follow once the act is in force. Well, first of all, they must apply in writing to the landlord with a description of the pet for which the consent is sought. And it needs to be a specific pet, not just a general description of, I would like a dog. You would have to say, it's a Labrador dog called Millie, for instance. And the landlord will then have 28 days to either give consent or refuse consent, and they'll need to do that in writing. And the landlord may ask the tenant for more information if it's reasonable. And if this happens, the deadline gets extended by 7 days after the tenant has provided the information to the landlord. And if the tenant doesn't provide the information, then the landlord doesn't need to give or refuse consent. A lot of landlords have asked me, well, what happens if you've got a flat and either the lease says that you can't have a pet or that you have to get consent from the freeholder? So, under the Renters' Rights Bill, if the landlord needs consent from a superior landlord, so for instance, if they're a leaseholder and they need the permission of the freeholder, then they have to apply for that consent within the 28-day period of receiving the tenant's request. And they can delay giving or refusing consent until 7 days after they've received consent or refusal from the superior landlord. So let's move on to other good reasons why a landlord might have to turn down a request for a pet. There won't be a one-size-fits-all list of reasonable grounds, and landlords will need to consider requests on their merits on a case-by-case basis. The government will publish guidance after the Renters' Rights Act becomes law, but here's my common sense approach to what's likely to be considered reasonable grounds to refuse a request. First of all, the type of pet isn't appropriate for the property. So you've got a Great Dane in a studio flat. Number two, the number of pets might be too high for the property. One small dog might be okay in a small flat, but three large dogs might not be. And the landlord might have reasonable concerns about the welfare of the pet. So, a request to keep a dog when the tenants don't work from home and they have long hours and the dog will be left for more than 4 hours a day on a regular basis. Another one is for the landlord has good reason to believe that the tenant won't be a responsible pet owner. For instance, after failing a home visit by an appropriate organisation. Another one is that the landlord may have an allergy to the pet in question. And for an HMO, unless it's a joint tenancy and all tenants agree to keeping a pet, you can turn it down if it's an HMO because that's just going to be too difficult. You've got people moving in and moving out, and you never know if the next person's not going to like a dog, or even if the other residents, the other people that live there will want a dog or just feel pressured into accepting a dog. So, what will tenants be able to do if landlords turn down their request and they don't think it's a good reason? Now have the right to appeal to the private rented sector ombudsman once it's launched, or by taking the case to court. And as the ombudsman will be free for tenants, it's likely that's what most tenants will do. Both parties will have to submit evidence to the ombudsman or to the court, and then the judge or the ombudsman will consider the case, look at all the evidence, and decide what they think is right in the circumstances. The Renters' Rights Bill is making changes to the Tenant Fees Act so that landlords can either charge a tenant their reasonable costs for taking out insurance against the risk of pet damage, or requiring tenants to do it themselves as a term of their tenancy agreement. So, if the landlord takes out the insurance, they can charge the tenant for the reasonable cost. And it's likely that this product will either be a standalone product for pet damage or an extra to the landlord insurance. And I think that this is going to be the most common approach, as landlords will then know that it is properly insured and that the tenant hasn't cancelled it. I said at the beginning I would share tips on what landlords can do to reduce the chance of pet damage. So I'll go through it now. Does the landlord feel comfortable, reasonably comfortable, that the tenant or the applicant is likely to be a responsible pet owner? So, if it's an existing tenant, you'll know if they've looked after the property properly. If they're an applicant, ask for a pet reference, and not just from their current landlord, but from their previous landlord, because the current landlord might want to get a shot of them. And are they going to be out of work all day? I mean, no one wants a yapping dog all day when their owners are out at work. And are they, if it's a new pet, are they getting it from a reputable breeder? Are they going to do puppy classes? And do they seem to know what's involved? For instance, do they know how to look after the pet properly? Have a chat to them. Ask how often are they going to take it out for a walk if it's a dog? Do they know that they're going to have to pick up the poo from the garden? It's never a popular task, but you've got to keep on top of it. And if it's a cat, they need to make sure the cat uses the litter tray and doesn't just go on the carpet or wherever it likes. And, dogs really cannot be left for long periods alone. So it might be reasonable for uh, pet owners to leave a cat while they go on holiday as long as somebody comes in and feeds it and plays with it. But you can't do that with a dog. And by and large, tenants who've left their property in good condition and they've complied with the terms of the tenancy agreement, they're likely to be responsible pet owners because they're responsible tenants and responsible people. And so you're more likely to be able to trust them if they've shown that they're worthy of that trust as tenants. And if your current tenant is asking to keep a pet, you'll be well placed to decide this yourself. And if it's an applicant asking to keep a pet, you'll have to make an assessment yourself on whether or not you think they're going to be responsible. And so, for instance, you could arrange a visit to where they live. Sometimes people do this to do the right to rent checks as well. But also there are some pet charities who'll do home visits to check to see how well the pet is being looked after and whether there's obvious damage. If you want to do the home visit yourself, these are some of the things I'd look out for. How does the dog respond when you go in? Is it a growly dog? How does it respond in the garden? Is it aggressive? What's the state of the garden? Have they picked up the poo? Is there a scratch pole for a cat? Does the dog have a crate? Does it seem to have a proper bed? And take a deep breath. Does the property smell? Because that will tell you whether or not that they're keeping the carpet clean and mopping up after any accidents. And have a look at the condition of the woodwork and the carpet. Can you see that there's any little chewing marks on the door frames or scratches? And then you can see whether the dog or the cat is likely to be destructive, and they're not all destructive. And if they have a cat, do they need a cat flap? And if so, who will pay for it? Is it even feasible? Because a lot of the new UPVC doors at the back are very expensive, and if they're going to have to have a new door, then the tenants should pay for that. And can you see whether the cat has been trained to use the litter tray? And if a visit isn't practical, you can ask to see photos of the pet. And, all genuine pet owners have lots of photos of their pets. And so you could ask to see the videos and just get a feel for the dog or the cat. I did this when I had tenants that were moving to the UK from abroad, and I saw the dog and thought it looked like a very good dog. And there was no damage from the dog when they left the property a few years later. As with any time a tenant moves in, make sure you've got a detailed inventory that really shows the condition of the carpets and the woodwork, etc. So it's absolutely clear what condition the property was in before they moved in with the dog or the cat. And without this, it may be difficult to prove the condition of the property before the pet moved in. And another thing which is, general good advice for landlords is to carry out regular inspections. So it's important for all tenants, but all the more so after the landlord has given consent for the tenant to keep a pet. So make sure that you go a couple of weeks after the pet moves in to set expectations and to spot any early signs of damage. And if you're a pet owner yourself, you might be able to give them some tips. And you can use this time to check the welfare of the pet to see if it's being looked after and whether the tenant is complying with the pet policy, which I'll get into in a minute. But make sure you follow up in writing if you've got any concerns, which is just standard advice for dealing with tenants. And if you spot any problems, you should go again in a short period of time and not leave it another 6 to 12 months. It's important to document your permission properly. So, if you do allow tenants to have a pet, make sure you document it properly by having a clause in the agreement or in a separate addendum. And if it's an existing tenant, which gives permission for that particular pet, and making sure it's not a blanket approval for all future pets. The clause should also refer to a detailed pet policy that sets out your expectations. And you can see the clause that I used here. And next, it's really important to have a pet policy. So you set your expectations and it's annexed to your tenancy agreement, or it's annexed to the addendum or side letter that you give permission for them to have the pet. And you can find a simple pet policy that's based on the policy I use for my own properties at theindependentlandlord.com/pet-policy. This pet policy is just for guidance, and note my disclaimer, but it covers how tenants should ask for consent to keep a pet, expectations of how they need to look after the pet, and expectations about how they must look after the property during the tenancy and what happens at the end of the tenancy. For instance, carpet cleaning to a professional standard. You can't actually insist that they use professional cleaners to do the carpet. You can find more guidance in my blog post, theindependentlandlord.com/renters-rights-pets. For more content on the Renters' Rights Bill, you can check out my training on the Renters' Rights Bill and my Renters' Rights Updates playlist. And you can keep up to date for free by not making any effort at all by signing up for my free weekly newsletter at theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. Finally, if you got this far, please give the video a thumbs up. It really helps. See you soon.